Bonjour à tous, très heureux de vous.
Good morning, welcome. Very happy to welcome you to this session, which it is my honor to moderate on innovation research, which is quite those are crucial topics. Just a couple of words of introduction. First, a technical word. You know that you have to wear a mask in this room, and then let's move on to the substance. Well, this is quite a significant topic because, just like you, I was amazed by the fact that France has no vaccine, which was a kind of a wound to our pride. You know, we spend a lot of money on R&D, the country of Pasteur, not the only country of the Security Council not to have a vaccine. Many people got traumatized, and researchers. So we're asking ourselves the question in France, I mean, why are we innovating less than before? And what's the problem? What's the issue? Because we'll discuss it later on in the debate. When we spend 6-7 billion euros on the tax rebate for research in France, yet we can see that there is a problem with innovation or insufficiencies in many domains. So to discuss it, I have with me an amazing panel, which I will introduce. I will introduce the various speakers, but first I will give the floor to Maya Bakash-Beauvalet, who will set the stage, the main ideas of discussion, and to understand the key for innovations and how could we get more than what we have today. Maya, thank you for being here despite the heat and the fatigue. And so this is an idea we discussed. You know, the country of Pasteur, France, was not able to find a COVID vaccine. So what I'd like to look at together is the mechanism, the economic mechanism, which make it possible that more R&D, more innovation is good for the country, is good for growth. Well, you know, what is the cause-effect mechanism? So if you finance R&D, well, you increase the number of inventions. I mean, this is what researchers will find in their labs. Then inventions will turn into innovation. That is, inventions which found a market, which find a niche, they turn into a product, they can be sold, they can be used. And behind that, the idea is that innovations are not done for the sake of it. They're there to improve productivity of workers, of capital, or whatever. And we hope in the long term that productivity will give an increase of GDP. GDP is not a dirty word, you know. It's just the mean average revenue of a country. It's a goal that can be shared, you know, quite normally for any given country. So this is the only pathway that is taught in the first year in economics, and everything has to be reviewed. Actually, this is what I'd like to get back to. So when you said to accelerate R&D to accelerate the future, well, first, two types of challenges. So is this cause-effect chain correct? By financing R&D, well, is it done well and can it be improved? Then the total amount of money dedicated to research in France, is it sufficient? The structure of this funding, is it good? For example, the sharing between public-private, is it good? The hinging or the articulation between public and private research, is it good? Are some sectors more or less financed than they should be? Those are issues on the financing structures and the financing tools. And this is the easiest part, in fact. Why? Because we've worked a lot on these issues, and there's some kind of a consensus. We know that public research is important for fundamental R&D. In R&D, there is development, and you know, we're far from fundamental, but still, you know, you need public research that will make it possible to open up domain sectors where the outcome will be somewhat uncertain and random, and we don't know when. And in that respect, public funding is essential. But there are also points of discussion, for example, on the mode of funding, the tax credit for research. Second stakes would be indeed, in fact, this the innovation that is being implemented. Can it be done alone? That is, That is how you articulating the R&D policies with other types of policies. And we know that it's possible to finance R&D as much as you want, but if next to it you didn't finance education training, if you did not disseminate it throughout the territory, if you don't reduce the inequalities, and if you don't increase the competition policies for the innovations to reach markets, well, it doesn't work. We discussed it with Philippe Allion. Competition policies are essential for innovation to be transformed and become creative on any given market. And third stake, which we might not be discuss it, but we should keep in mind, the third stake is that what is it for? What do we R&D is to increase the GDP? Well, in fact, well, is it a good objective? And in fact, in France, we have an important discussion that we could have on the final objective. For example, environmental stakes, are they correctly taken into account in R&D research? Or could R&D help us solve climatic problems? Or is it an arbitration to be made between one or the other? The well-being inequalities, healthcare inequalities, we are. Well, all those stakes show that possibly innovation is not just end purpose, consensual, accepted, but maybe we have to articulate this innovation objective with other political objectives. Thank you. Now, to kick off the discussion, we'll go to the US with Mr. Akshijit, who is economy professor at the University of Chicago, and who will discuss two key points to accelerate innovation, of course, the education policies and the competition policies Maya mentioned already, and explain to us how competition policy is essential to develop innovation. Mr. Akshijit, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Yes, excellent. Very good.
It's okay.
So thank you very much for having me today. I would like to mention two key points in my intervention. We have done extensive studies in order to understand how innovation policy could be most effective. And indeed, we also studied the French economy. And our study was recently published in the Review of Economic Studies, where we studied the link between basic research and applied research in France. Now, two key points I would like to mention is the following. As our moderator also mentioned, R&D tax credit type of policies do not seem to be very effective. And if it's not effective, this could be at least due to two reasons. Either the firms have a problem, or the individuals or the scientists have a problem, or both. So let's start with the firms. So when we look at the firm level data, not only in France, not only in the US, but globally, we see a rise in market concentration. What do I mean by market concentration? Market concentration is typically the market share of the largest firms in every industry. And there's a massive rise in market concentration. So large firms are accruing a bigger and bigger share of the economic activity. Second, new firm creation is declining over time. So there's less and less new firm creation, and there are less young firms. Why is this relevant? This is relevant because the innovation incentives of the large incumbents and young entrants is different. Young entrants are trying to come up with the most radical innovations in order to prove themselves to the market, whereas large market leaders are trying to typically invest in defensive R&D, not productive R&D, not radical innovation, but more tinkering, incremental innovation, and defensive innovation. When we look at the data, typically large firms are producing what we call the patent fences, defensive patenting. So because of this, of course, when you provide government subsidy to incumbents, large incumbents are using this money not to push the frontier, but to do more defensive activities. So we see this type of evidence in many different countries. For instance, we studied the Italian economy. In Italy, what we see is quite interesting. What we did is the following. We linked the registry of local politicians to the social security data so that we could see if firms are getting more and more politically connected by hiring politicians to the firms. And it's very striking. As the firm is becoming the dominant market leader, what they do is they are producing less innovation, less patents relative to their size, but they hire more politicians relative to their size. So this is one piece of evidence where you can see that, for instance, the large incumbents are trying to do more defensive innovations. Second, when we look at the US economy, the quality of the patents of the large incumbents is much worse than the quality of the patents of young entrant firms. So again, this is probably because large firms are trying to do tinkering innovations around their existing portfolios, and they are not trying to push the frontier. Third, when we look at the US economy, what we see is that large market leaders are doing strategic hiring, meaning that what they try to do is they try to hire key scientists, key engineers from the rivals in order to kill competition. So given this bad intention or bad incentive of market leaders to kill competition, if you provide R&D tax credit, typically large incumbents who have an army of lawyers are benefiting from this. So that's why I think the first thing that we should do when we are thinking about design of innovation policy, we have to think about one-size-fits-all type of policies are not very effective. We should think about targeted policies. We should think about size-dependent policies. We should think about age-dependent policies in order to exploit these type of variation in the market. The second point, so that's why competition policy or maintaining competition in the market and doing targeted policy is key for effective innovation policy. Otherwise, in concentrated markets, innovation policy will not be effective. The second point I would like to mention is the following. While firms are spending R&D dollars, of course, at the end of the day, they try to hire scientists and engineers so that they can produce innovations. But if there are no enough talents in the economy, no matter how much you subsidize firms, it won't be very effective. And we see this in the data. For instance, in the United States, when you exploit the tax credit variation across states, when a state is introducing an R&D tax credit, innovation output is not increasing, but the salaries of the scientists or the salaries of the engineers is going up. This is because the supply of scientists is fixed. Unless you relax the supply of scientists, unless you improve the talent pool in the economy, innovation policy will not be very effective. So that's why it is extremely important to think about coupling education policy with innovation policy. For this point, we studied the Danish economy in great detail using the microdata from Denmark, where we looked at the social security records, the IQ data, the R&D spending, the patent data, etc. And what we see is that educating the right talents is the key input for effective innovation policy. Unless you educate the right people, it's not going to be very effective. So, for instance, when you look at the US economy, or when you look at also various European countries, there's a very strong relationship between probability of becoming an inventor and the income of the parents. So if a kid is born to a rich family, then the likelihood of that kid to become an inventor is a lot higher. This is because of the income inequality. And since everybody does not have an equal chance for education, they are not getting the right education, and they are not becoming the scientists, or they are not able to do PhD to produce innovations and patents. So that's why I think it is extremely crucial also to think about education policy combined with innovation policy. There's pecking order of policy recipes. Fix the talent pool first. Once the talent pool is fixed and improved in the economy, then go and subsidize the firms to hire those talents. But without doing the first step, the second step won't be very effective. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting to set the stage as you've just done. One key point is this topic of concentration. A lot of work been done. The economist Philippe Allion, who's worked also on the topic, has mentioned that it is worrying to see that concentration in some markets, especially the GAFAM, for example, in digital, has hindered innovation. And this is exactly what you said, actually. Now, we'll go straight more into detail with Mathieu Portepuis, who runs SCA Partner, who is a consulting office, and he will give us the key innovation SCI Partner in view of the works he does in companies. And he will mention a key point, which is of interest to me, to say why the failure of the vaccine in France is not a failure per se. It's a misleading impression we all had. So tell us why we should not despair. Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation. Do you think there is a Swiss fiasco in the vaccine? Because Swiss spends 3 times more money in R&D in pharmaceutical research than in France. Do you know a Swiss vaccine for COVID-19? Sorry, no. So the truth is, for the last 20 years, a good pharma boss is the one who sells his vaccine activities. So why does he sell them? Because it's not profitable versus other divisions or departments. And in fact, we see it in the stock rating of companies who deployed their COVID vaccine. Those who worked on treatment actually took advantage thereof, except for Moderna. So reality is, the failure of public authorities more than 2 years in there, and this disregard for science and vaccine. So the initial problem is the signal, the initial signal. I'm talking about the intellectual property right of vaccine. This is an absurd discussion. The issue is that today, if you're a pharma manager, you have no interest in deploying a vaccine. So I'm talking about financial interest. I'm not talking about societal interest. And the discussion could be transposed to climate change. If there is no carbon price, well, there will be no massive investment in R&D to develop technologies that deal with the problem of carbon. So the responsibility of public authorities is real, and there is no French fiasco. First, there was a global effort. It is a global issue. It's not a national issue. And what the crisis has demonstrated is that in the open science ecosystems, those are really won, you know, the DARPA or the BARDA. It's not a national topic. It's a call for project towards the most performing ecosystem. So the essential problem, I mean, I won't go into but well, I think it's amazing that we should ask the question before thinking about the efficacy of public research agency in France. I mean, let's be serious, let's start with, the fundamentals. The second problem was mentioned. We have half the number of PhDs in France that they have in India. So you pay this in the ecosystems, in talents. And the reality is that, well, today, when you do a PhD, you're brilliant in France, you should not stay in France. I know that indeed, it increases salaries in other markets, but in France, researchers, are poorly paid. It's a reality, even in private corporations. So yes, we have to correct or reshuffle the education system. We must better pay the researchers, get them back when they went overseas. Well, maybe we have to work on social, maybe reduce the social contributions imposed to researchers. But there is a problem in France for research, be it applied or fundamental. So basic. So now, of course, we could think about is it fair and fair, whatever. But honestly, I think there are structural issues which are not be discussed upstream. Now, what I want to say is that there is a true topic, a real topic in that respect. Then France. Now, if I stick to the French topic, there is the problem of audacity. We don't know how to choose our fights. Do we go for this or that? Well, you have to think. You have to establish a strategy, because technological sovereignty is not to produce everything at home. The Americans have shown that, and we are in a market which is becoming more and more global. R&D market is getting higher and higher in the global market, but there is a globalization taking place from the top and from the bottom. Asians are emerging in the rating of companies that do R&D, and there is also a innovation systems are put into competition at the basis. In the 90s, the U.S. companies did 90% of their R&D in the U.S. territory. They 80% today. They will be at 60% in 10 years. The second countries where our U.S. R&D is done is in India. It's not because they get subsidies, but because there is an efficacy in the Indian system when it comes to research production. So this is a global competition, talent competition, ecosystem competition. The good news is that in Europe, there will be the European DARPA, the ERA, which will have a budget of 100 billion euros, 100 million euros. So there will be a problem of where to place it. Well, it should replace the Strasbourg Parliament, so that we'll have scientists rather than politicians. But anyway, this is an approach that we could develop. Now, I'd like to talk about companies because it's my business. You know, I'm here to support companies. I think we enter a sequence where there will be more and more scientific companies. And there it is interesting because companies do play a role in the relationship between society and science. Science is a political topic today. Ideologies have changed today. Science is a political object, and companies, scientific companies, be they small or large, besides biotech or big tech, you know, Paul-François will discuss that, but will be quite massive. But there are very few of the moments where we should question ourselves and say, okay, indeed, we need scientific companies, and it will be a new axis for investors, for finance, to know when the tomorrow's value will be created. Thank you. Now, to add, I'm kicking off the discussion because the question is there, so to make sure there is no mistake on the vaccine. But in the criticism you express, you talk about, the scattering and the poor. You know, we're sorry about the fact that in France, we don't invest as much as the US or elsewhere, but the amount of money there was huge. So why the Nantes vaccine company got more money from London than from Paris? Is it? I mean, it should be a problem. The amount injected. You know, the public authorities are very reluctant to help. Well, of course, there is a problem of risk aversion in the way research programs are driven in France. Well, you know, I'll let Paul-François discuss that because it's a great transition. Thank you. So Paul-François Fournier from BPI France. So we want to hear you on the role of public authorities. And this is a question I've asked on do we put enough and at the right place? Yeah, I think the question is, do we put the money in the right place? And at the end, I'll answer about to accelerate R&D, well, there are, domains, and I agree with this thing of the scattering or, spreading all over the place, but in fact, the question is, where do we accelerate? Where should we increase? Well, since our creation, the way innovation is created is changing. We've gone through great years after war with major R&D centers. I was at France Telecom, the CNET. When you came out of a school of engineer, they had the money, they had technology, and they had subcontractors. And all this was managed by great engineers who had 15 years plans. But this model is gone, is exploding, is collapsing with the digital, because the digital provided access to technology, which was the property, and now everybody can access. My son has an Amazon account, and he has the calculation power of Sopra Steria in a couple of minutes. Is my, the kids don't want large structures; they want to have more direct lives, and they are now economic finance system where the state is a player of capital risk, which allows for financing to take place. Well, in this complex world of digital where everything is possible, the small structure, 10, 15, 20 people, is better suited at the beginning of the value creation process than the major center or the major structure, which has to align hundreds and hundreds of people. We'll talk about the end of the process at least, but at the beginning. So our conviction is that the startup is not a fashion. It's a change, systemic change in the way the beginning of the innovation process is created. And it doesn't mean either that major R&D centers will no longer do innovation. there is a progressive transfer of value, and we have to be in this new world, which led to the creation of the French tech and to the dynamics that we see being created now with a fairly stable, durable policy to create this startup ecosystem. Second thing I'd like to share with you is that, in fact, these mechanisms made it possible to create innovation affiliate. We're creating in France some kind of a digital startup domain, which are becoming group. We think there will be one or two groups of digital which will be in the CAC 40. Those are companies which will be worth 10 billion euros or dollars with thousands of employees. So it's a new domain. It's a new. We took this late, but I think the good news is that there is, well, since the same cause produces the same effect, this fragmentation is coming in the more traditional domains. And in fact, healthcare is quite ahead versus the other domains, and that already has all the codes. That is traditional domains. We'll see startups that will create the technological bricks of innovation. You know, in the space industry, I thought, you know, which is well organized. Well, we see now small companies, even in France, in Toulouse, which are in fact small technology companies, which will make it possible to accelerate transformation. This is what we call the deep tech. They ask for more technologies in the research centers, and the topic is how are we going to accelerate technological transfer of these research centers towards the market. The good news is that in France we have the ingredients, and the race is coming, the wave is coming. So we got large research centers and a startup ecosystem which exists. And now, for us, the topic now is to take this wave upstream, and let's take the young entrepreneur, the young guy from Polytechnics at 7 or 8 years, said, let's start your business, you know, instead like me, go and start your startup in telco, we'll take PhDs, and we say, yes, indeed, you won't get a good salary from the by the step, but you create your own startup ecosystem, you can create value. But instead of going to Facebook and be depressed, well, create your own value just by accelerating technology transfer. It is starting. It's a race. It's a major race for the next 10 years. And for this, we need to change our financing system. And of course, we must make sure that the state, we talked about, all this should fit back into the traditional domains. Well, the DTech startups are in the traditional domains, so the state and major stakeholders, well, we should redefine the value. So, you know, Valneva is not an R&D domain. Valneva is financing startups for the problem of Valneva is that the British were able to buy 400 million vaccines, which are worth, you know, for 400 million euros. Europe and France were not equipped to buy the vaccines for several reasons of organization, because there will be an innovation agency. So it's a problem of, you know, of the decision makers. It's not the R&D as such. So these startups will have to reintegrate traditional domains to restore innovation and find new dynamics in these domains, which are essential because in Europe, in France, we are lucky to have those domains.
Merci beaucoup. Et ça ouvre plein de questions qui seront, j'espère.
Thank you very much. That leads to lots of questions that could be coming from the hall. To rebound off what you were just saying, Vincent Paris, you've had the eye of the industrialist, the public sector, the industrialist, Soprasteria, an IT company. How can you identify what's working and what's not working in the research system? What are you expecting from the state? Perhaps you could address the topic of the research tax credit. Does this boost innovation? Is it working well? Do we need to change it? We would like you to shed your light on this as someone who innovates and who is expecting some help from the state that's not arriving. Hello, everyone. To begin with, in case in this room there are people who are wondering if this question is an important one, let me come back to a story that reveals the importance of this question. This story is one of messenger messenger RNA. Jacques Monod and François Jacot discovered this. They were Nobel Prize winners in 1965 and 93. The Pasteur Institute pushed it to make vaccines, and we didn't find the necessary financing. And everyone knows the story that it was taken over by foreign labs. So this question is a central one, the continuum between research and bringing products to market. And I would like to share with you 3 strong convictions that I have, things that should be driving us. My first conviction is that we need to completely reinvent partnerships, the public-private partnerships. You've talked about this. It's true that there is many different ways of thinking that intersect. There are some who say that it's not a public affair because the state is not efficient, doesn't have the initiative to be entrepreneurs. And then there's another way of thinking that says that the only reason that companies exist is to generate profits, and they don't have a long-term view of society, and we can't ask companies to do this. And the reality is more complex than this, and one of the elements that we have to take into account is the return on investment. Is it a long-term return, or is it a short one? If it takes 30 years to get a payback, no private company will want to invest. And that is where the state can play a more important role in strategy as a well-advised investor to not spread investment around too much. We need to push harder in some fields and in a targeted way. I think of defense, I think of health, energy transformation. All of these fields must be points of interest for the state. Mechanisms must be set up. And on other topics, however, they need to continue to push to make some sectors more attractive by reducing taxes. The private sector must play its role. And there's this duality that we need to work on. There are 2 examples that come to mind. Is what Israel is doing. On each interesting topic, the state invests half of the budget, the private sector the other half. If it doesn't work, the private sector is not obliged to pay back the state. If it works, they pay back the state with an interesting and worthwhile added value. If we look at the effectiveness of this system, it's well above what we can find in other countries. I'll just add, it's important to look at what's going on around us. We've criticized the Trump administration a lot in vaccine management. But if they hadn't injected $2 billion into 4 labs to create emulation, we would not be where we are today. The second conviction that I want to share with you is that digital is at the heart of all of this. So that works for us as Soprasteria. We're #1 in digital transformation in Europe, and no one's challenging that. All industries, all services understand that digital is at the heart of it. Vaccines were discovered thanks to digital. This gives us 2 important drivers in France. One is competitiveness. We talk about augmented engineering, and that allows us to relocate jobs because competitiveness can be increased in a strong manner this way. And another important aspect is green energy, clean industry. There are lots of initiatives. We have state aid, hydrogen trains, for instance, that are being worked on. We're only at the beginning, and I think that there's a real extraordinary opportunity to bring us back into the heart of the game, where we were outrun in industry for dozens of years now, and I think that we can play a role again if we get on the train properly. The last conviction I would like to share with you, which is the most important one for me, we need to give vision, we need to give meaning to progress. We need to build competition around progress. We need to get people on board with the idea of research and progress. We're in a society today where people are afraid. The principle of precaution has done a lot of damage. We need to get rid of this as quickly as possible. We see it with vaccines. I can give you dozens of examples. In each technological breakthrough, this has happened. There's been fear, if I remember many things. When we invented the train, it took a lot of years to get people to accept having trains and tunnels. People were afraid of the thermal shock that would happen. So there are two categories of people in societies: those who work on progress, who take risks, who have a project, who are forward-looking with ambition, and that know how to use all of these technologies. And there are the others who hide in a corner and are afraid of technologies. We have the means, but the time is now, and we need to change these dynamics. We need to have a more positive attitude to progress, public-private partnerships, digital, and bringing back a positive attitude to this. Thank you. So to conclude the panel, I'm going to hand the floor to Alf Ren, who's an economist from the University of Southern Denmark and who has studied this topic in depth across the world to see what innovation systems work well. So after having heard from French examples, tell us what's working the best elsewhere, the keys to make the innovation system work. And also, can you touch on Scandinavia? Because Denmark has an excellent reputation. Denmark and Sweden are always ranked at the top of innovation for patent applications. So what is this alchemy that works so well in Northern Europe?
Je suis très désolé, je parle en anglais, mais I believe that my English is easier for you than my Danish or my Finnish. I'm happy to speak in Danish if you so wish. Let me start by pointing out that we are here to discuss mastering the future of innovation and R&D. And I want to start by pointing out that I believe that even before the pandemic, we were actually in an innovation crisis. We rarely talk about this because innovation has been hijacked by this overly optimistic notion that we are continuously making endless progress. But let us look a little bit at the facts. Globally, we spend annually a minimum, an absolute minimum of $3,000 billion on innovation. I could make a case for a far higher figure. I would say $4,500 billion would be about right. Now, $3 trillion is such a huge figure, it needs to be put in context. That is the gross national product of Sweden, Norway with its oil millions, Finland with its IT, Denmark with a lot of stuff, and Iceland put together and doubled. That is what we spend annually on innovation globally. Yet at the same time, we missed the pandemic, and this year too, more than 700,000 children will die of diarrhea, an illness we've been able to conquer for more than 100 years. That is the state of innovation today. A tremendous amount of resources, a tremendous amount of knowledge. We have never been wiser, more informed. We've never carried more supercomputers in our pockets. Yet, we lack an innovation ambition. And we lack, as several colleagues here have pointed out, a direction of actually solving the right problems rather than the problems that are staring us in the face. If we look at how R&D is developing at this very moment, what we are seeing is not necessarily an expansion of innovation ambition, but rather an accelerating myopia. Globally, we can see that the funds that are going towards novel innovation projects tend to go to more and more limited fields. Pandemic response being very clear, because in our arrogance, we believe that now pandemic response will always be the thing that will define us. AI, which I do personally love, but still. Automation and circular economy, with a few other things. Now, these are all fine things to study. These are absolutely fantastic technologies to get your head around. Yet we know throughout history, true innovation has come from basic research into fields that are originally considered silly, childish, foolish, and definitely unnecessary because they do not have any commercial gains to give. We know that the original research into what today is considered fine pharma was considered stupid because it didn't respond to the exact demands we had right then. We know that in the 1970s, IBM was heavily criticized for studying a stupid technology known as artificial intelligence, because everyone knew that was just for silly researchers and would never have any commercial validity. We know that the internet was considered a child's toy for nerds and geeks that would never impact an economy. Yet today, with our humanity's endless capacity for arrogance, we know that today we know better. Today we have conquered this knowledge problem of information. And today we can totally see what we should focus on. What I'm saying is that if we want to have and master a future for innovation, we need less arrogance and more ambition, capacity to look at what are actually the big problems, including those children dying I referred to. We need a humility in the face of what we actually can learn and what technologies might actually have an impact not 5 years from now, not 10 years from now, but in innovation trajectories that project decades into the future, because otherwise we are cutting off the innovation stem for our children and our children's children. As the Bible says, the sins of the fathers shall be visited upon the sons to the third and the fourth generation. So what we need is what I believe the Nordic countries have actually been rather good at. An expansive education system, as of course also our colleague, the esteemed gentleman from Chicago, started by pointing out. An openness to not just fall for what is fashionable or commercially viable right now, but investments into basic research that may see their commercial application basically after our lifetimes. But these two are necessary. The Nordic system has been one of exploration rather than exploitation. And it is that which has enabled even a country so highly taxed as Denmark, because I want to tell you something, France. Last week came out the news, Denmark has now passed you in something, we're actually higher taxed than France. I know it sounds impossible, but it can be done. Denmark did it. And yet the Danish economy is actually doing well. Because despite this taxation, there has been the openness to innovation, the openness to science, as my esteemed colleague here pointed out in the very beginning, and an openness that tomorrow will look very different from today. So less arrogance, more humility, more ambition and less hubris, and more than anything else, a belief that the future can actually be better. Thank you very much.
Merci, merci beaucoup. Moi, je retiens quand même cette...
Thank you. I like the example of Denmark, which is extraordinary. They are now taken the #1 spot in terms of taxation, and yet remains a country where innovation is very strong. And that should lead us to think a little bit about this and to look in detail as to why the Nordic countries can innovate despite or with heavy taxation.
From Chicago made a very important point early on. What has actually enabled the Nordic countries to succeed is what I myself actually benefited from. So I do not come from good stock. I come from the working classes. My parents and their parents were dirt poor. Yet I was given all the possibilities of the world's best education and became a full professor at the tender age of 31. I fought against the class system. That is what has made the Nordics great. An openness for everyone's possibility, a capturing of all the talent, an inclusivity and a diversity of thinking, rather than who went to what school when.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, il nous reste donc un petit quart d'heure pour lancer le...
So, thank you for that. We have 15 minutes before we have to conclude the debate. I'd like to ask a question, and then I'll allow questions from the floor. Let me begin with Europe. You've talked about this topic a bit. Europe that had the feeling of being a surpassed by the US and China in the years. It's actually more than a feeling, it's a reality. So by basing ourselves on the DARPA model, or DARPA, you talked about this earlier, Mr. Courtecuisse. Is this the right model? Some are worried already about its management, its resources. Mr. Courtecuisse would like to comment, and then Mr. Fournier. Do you have any elements about this? Go ahead, Mr. Courtecuisse. The fact that there's an acceleration in the calendar is very positive, but there's always a risk in Europe that we'll build a bureaucratic system. So we need to preserve the original spirit of what the DARPA and DARPA do. We have to be pay attention to the sovereign nature. There's a basis the British and the British ecosystems could benefit from this, and I think that they should. Once again, we're in a extraterritorial reasoning, and we're focusing on an objective, which is to finance projects with the best minds across the world, wherever they are. So that's what we need to preserve. And then we'll see over time how this is confirmed. But from a financial standpoint, it's well-sized, and we have to have the ability to digest. Once again, there's the problem about how we're able to digest all of this. And a point of vigilance, we talked about this overspreading of resources, but there's something else can happen between the catch-up process and what can happen in the future. There are lots of catch-up topics about innovation of yesterday, saying we really need to be sovereign in terms of the cloud. But maybe we should be sovereign in terms of quantic calculation rather than trying to catch up something that's already beyond us. So let's be careful about that. The sovereign dystopia that can add to nationalistic thinking that can lead to problems. We need to see how this works out over time, but let's hope it goes well. Mr. Fournier, would you like to add to this? I haven't. What about the philosophy of the project? As I said earlier, the French president talked about a health innovation agency. The priority of this agency, in our opinion, and that's what was announced, is once again the state as a customer of a health system that they finance, that's giving their priorities, and that's capable of buying. And Europe doesn't have the competency in terms of health, wasn't able to buy. You talked about the considerable resources that the U.S. put forward. It's not with 400 million over 6 months that you're going to come up with an mRNA vaccine. We need to accelerate industrialization and not focus on research that's been in the pipeline for years. And we were lucky we have to admit that. I'd like to come back to the spreading out of investment. Since we're in X, I think we need to get away from some words that I think are a bit too lazy in terms of thinking. There's a more complex idea behind this that we need to think about. There are sectors that we need to invest in, and as you said, there's a thought to be given to quantic research, medium-term topics. In France, we've lacked just financing for research. We haven't invested enough over time. We need to find the financing. We need to be able to bring our research to market. There's public infrastructure around hydrogen. We need public infrastructure to set up this infrastructure. For semiconductors, it's a battle for billions of euros in investment. We need to subsidize these actors. At some point, we shouldn't be spreading out investment too much. But if we think that innovation also comes from startups, from young entrepreneurs, and from PhD students, we have to accept that some of this financing has to go to help these people. And to be direct with you, thank goodness we financed some entrepreneurs that 10 or 15 years ago, or researchers that launched their startups on quantic calculation when the state hadn't yet understood the importance. We understood that it was going to be important that they had to invest 500 million euros. And I think we have to make some trade-offs and make some decisions and accept that entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurial ecosystems are incredible ways to create innovation and to have forward-looking thinking. And then the public policy makers have to accelerate on some sectors when we see a maturity arriving. I defend reasonable spreading of investment because entrepreneurs and researchers have more time than we do to understand what the future will hold, and we have to give them the opportunity to test their innovations and to create these future sectors. Thank you. I retain this reasonable spreading of investment. That's a good concept. The gentleman at the back of the room. Can you bring him a microphone, please? Thank you for these very interesting thoughts. I'd like to come back to a point. I believe that in France we have a very effective organization in R&D. It's the Direction Générale pour l'Armement that invests in all of the weapons development with the major companies and also with SMEs. Can the DGA serve as a model so that in France the state launch this type of organization on other strategic topics, 4 or 5 strategic topics, hydrogen, batteries, EV, because that model is really effective, and we've known this since 1961. The DGA has been very strong in this field. It's recognized worldwide, and perhaps this is a model that we could use. The question that you're asking is about the DARPA. Everyone's talking about this American agency linked to defense. Who would like to answer this? Can our DGA behave in the same way as the American agency does? That DARPA was independent, whereas the DGA in France is linked to the French ministry. Who would like to answer? We work a lot with the DGA. There's financing. We finance the DGA to a certain level. It's effective, but it works in fields where the state has a role to play, where they are the client for this company. They're the public operator, and they manage their industrial subsidiary with this model. Why not? For the Health Innovation Agency, that's similar. It's a health DGA managed by the state. The problem is that there are lots of sectors where the state is not the best organization to define the organization, and I'll let my colleagues talk about this. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have plans, vertical plans, which is what we did in the investments for the future on hydrogen. And I think that we shouldn't go too far and get the state to organize everything. I work for the DPI, and so I defend public action, but we have to recognize that there are limits. Our colleague talked about humility, and I think that we have to be humble. The crisis has proven that to us. Yes, the state can give meaning and take some options, and sometimes the state just has to be supportive of certain policies, and I'm not sure that it's the same organization that's required. Mr. Wren, I think you wanted to add something about these major agencies.
I think these military innovation agencies are actually fascinating. They're not fascinating because they're military, they're fascinating because they're open-minded. DARPA studied things that they had no idea what the military application would be for until decades later. DARPA could throw money at problems without actually knowing what they were solving. They were, in a sense, highly free innovation and R&D organizations. I do not know the French equivalent that well, but I would imagine that their success from part comes from being very scientific, that is open-minded, not too steered by the state that my colleague here is decrying. Saupoudrage sounds wonderful. I have no idea what it meant, and he might have taught me a dirty word in French. But anyway, so.
Merci beaucoup.
We don't have much time left. We can take another question. The gentleman here. Thank you for your contributions. I'd like to draw a parallel between the tangible aspects, the products, and the intangible aspects, the immaterial side. We saw that producing in China or Asia cost half the price. So there was a huge wave of delocalization, and now with logistics and strategic limitations, we're all talking about reindustrializing European countries. Is there not a risk today that with the wages that are 10 to 20 times lower in India, that we'll end up with a massive hangover, that we've subcontracted all the engineering and intangible side, and we didn't capitalize on the development of know-how in Europe? That's a good question for you on R&D. In the waves of delocalization, there is also the delocalization of R&D and innovation, looking for the lowest cost innovation. Is that dangerous? Should we reverse the trend? This is the question of globalization. In 20 years, and this is good news, all of these wages will go up. You just have to look at the Indian servers. The wages have gone up in the last 10 to 20 years. They're obliged to pay people more, and soon we'll be reaching what we are paying in terms of wages in Europe. That's good news. In terms of a global strategy, having all of one's R&D, all of one's manufacturing, we see that there are limits to this. But saying that we have to bring everything, repatriate everything, no. There's a question of cost and efficiency, of course. I believe in balance, that we need to have some backup possibilities. That's a strategy also. That's a problem. What do we do? And we don't want to end up with no solutions. And that was the problem a year ago. And for certain topics, we need to build the possibility to emulate, to challenge, and we need to look at this with a positive attitude and not be defensive, constantly defensive. We have time for one last question. This gentleman, who's raised his hand for quite some time now, you get the honor of asking the last question. I wanted to talk about Israel. We don't have the time. But I did attend the last roundtable about training with the Chicago professor who said that it's essential. No one gave a relevant answer to that. We need to train engineers. We need to train technicians. We need to train people in innovation and new technologies and in questions of climate. Do we need to create a tool? There are universities and institutions of higher education. We need to prepare all of our society to this huge change. The Germans have the joint system, and we're dragging our feet. Do you have a concrete idea beyond training people in companies, this race for talent? Can't we share this on a public-private level at a regional scale? I don't have an answer, but I think we need to create a tool where people will play the game. Is it possible, or is it just a pipe dream? Is it just something we talk about in conferences, we all go home, and we just continue to work in the same way? Mr. Aksijita, I believe you're still with us. Would you like to answer? I think you've been getting the translation. About training, you talked a lot about in your presentation. What's the key point to reach this level of training that we're really lacking? The gentleman is asking about a tool. What kind of advice could you give us?
Excellent point. So, training is important for at least two reasons. Number one, so of course we are all talking about creating new technologies, but in addition we have to also think about diffusing those technologies. What we are seeing over time is that technologies are also getting stuck within one or two companies, and they are not getting diffused across the economy. If you want the aggregate productivity to go up, we have to make sure that these technologies are being utilized more broadly. Now, if you have a strong educated workforce, in that case, these new technologies that are created by one or two firms can be imitated and absorbed by other firms too. So that way the technologies can get diffused in the economy more broadly. So that's why I think strengthening universities especially is important for two reasons. Number one, the knowledge diffusion will improve. Number two, we will also create more technologies more broadly. I would like to also emphasize one last point related to this training, which is a study that we have done with Philip Agyon and Otto Toivonen and Ari Haitinen in Finland. And what we have seen there is very interesting, actually. So when there's a new innovation in a company, you look at the wages, you look at the compensation of the workers. And very interestingly, it's typically young people's compensations that are increasing, and typically for seniors, the compensation is either not changing or it's declining, or they are getting even unemployed, the senior workers, even in an innovating company, even in a successful company. Then when we dig deeper into this, we found out something very interesting. Of course, being senior comes with positive, but it comes also with negative. It comes with a positive because people are more experienced, especially during the time of a crisis, how to manage the company, etc. But it's also coming with the cost that the education or the diploma is getting older. So in the data, when we control biological age with the age of the diploma, we see that the negative effect is coming from the age of the diploma. The biological age has a positive impact, which means that retraining programs where people's, when their education is getting older, bringing them back to the economy by retraining will also improve their participation overall in the economy, I think. So,
merci beaucoup. Alors, on a un peu...
Thank you so much. I'm sorry we're running out of time. So, Maya, can you conclude? What do you take away from these discussions? Thank you for all these contributions. There are three key points that come to mind. What we call targeted policy, the not spreading investment, or what they're calling in French the saupoudrage, which is the opposite of targeted policy. The state has to respect technological neutrality, laissez-faire attitude to innovation in one direction or another, but the targeted investment also in the type of company, targeting young companies that are just entering the market, that they can bring disruptive innovation. That's the first thing. Effective targeted investment. Number two, the role of the state, the role of public policy is not really in the amount of financing. That's a problem in itself. It's the ecosystem around it, the training, the freedom to set up on the market or not. It's a type of administrative agility that can support innovation or not. And the crucial point is competition. The opening of the market, that's very important. That's the third point, that research must be based in freedom. It's random. We have to leave freedom and randomness to take its effect in research. It can't be organized in a very strict way because there are so many random discoveries in research. And just to conclude, you talked a lot about the digital aspects. We talked a lot about opening up digital. That's the hope of the digital world. But we can't forget that this open world is being closed by what we call gatekeepers, these big platforms that control access to market of companies and consumers and startups, because the acquisition of startups is slowing innovation today. And so we need to regulate these gatekeepers, the platforms that control the markets. That is necessary. And Europe has started this work with the DMA, the Digital Market Act, that makes it possible to further regulate these massive platforms that are the main threat to innovation in the future. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the public and to our speakers. It was very interesting, lots of different opinions, and it gives us a lot of food for thought to improve innovation. Thank you all.